In 605 BC, a 25-year-old prince stood covered in blood on the battlefield of Carchemish on the banks of the Euphrates River. All around him, the bodies of Egyptian soldiers were scattered for miles. Tens of thousands of men who, hours earlier, formed the most feared army in the ancient world. Pharaoh Necho II, the same Pharaoh who had killed King Josiah of Judah, fled back to Egypt without looking back. And this prince, dirty, panting, sword still in hand, had just changed the course of human history forever. His name was Nebuchadnezzar. But here is what no one tells you. The man who destroyed Jerusalem, who burned Solomon's temple to the ground, and who dragged God's people in chains into exile. This same man built the greatest city the world had ever seen. A city with walls so wide that chariots could race on top of them, with hanging gardens that defied gravity, with a sewage system that Europe would only equal 2,000 years later. So how is it possible that the greatest builder of antiquity is remembered only as a destroyer? The answer is more complex and more fascinating than anything you have ever heard about him. To truly understand Nebuchadnezzar, you must first understand where he came from. And for that, we need to go back a little further in time, to an era when Babylon was only a shadow of what it had once been. You see, when most people hear the word Babylon, they imagine that colossal city with blue gates and towers that scratch the sky. But that Babylon, the Babylon everyone knows, did not always exist. In fact, for centuries, Babylon was a humiliated city, dominated and trampled by larger empires. The Assyrians, the most brutal empire the Middle East ever produced, treated Babylon like a dog on a leash for generations. In 689 BC, the Assyrian king Sennacherib became so fed up with Babylonian rebellions that he did something unthinkable. He destroyed Babylon completely. He razed the temples. He diverted the waters of the Euphrates to flood the ruins. And he declared that the city would never be rebuilt. Imagine that. The oldest city in Mesopotamia, a sacred place for practically every culture in the region, turned into a swamp on purpose. But the Assyrians made a mistake that empires often make. They underestimated the memory of a humiliated people. Because while Babylon rotted under the mud, a family was waiting, a family that did not forget. Nebuchadnezzar's father was named Nabopolassar, and his story is, in itself, extraordinary. Nabopolassar was a nobody. He had no royal blood. He inherited no throne. The Babylonian records, and here I am talking about cuneiform tablets that have survived more than 2,600 years, described Nabopolassar as the son of a nobody. He was a general, probably from a Chaldean tribe in southern Mesopotamia, who looked at the Assyrian Empire, the greatest military power on the planet, and said, "I am going to tear this down." And he did. In 626 BC, Nabopolassar took advantage of a civil war that was tearing Assyria apart from the inside and seized the throne of Babylon. But taking the throne was the easy part. Keeping it was another story. Assyria still had a massive army. It still controlled territories stretching from Egypt to Persia, and it was not going to accept losing Babylon without a fight. What followed were nearly 15 years of total war. Nabopolassar made an alliance with the Medes, a people from what is now Iran, and together they began to tighten the noose. In 614 BC, the Medes took Assur, the sacred city of the Assyrians. And then, in 612 BC, came the final blow. Nabopolassar and the Medes marched against Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, a city with walls 12 kilometers in perimeter and moats that seemed impassable. The siege lasted 3 months. And then, according to Babylonian records, a flood of the Tigris River destroyed part of the walls. Nabopolassar entered through the breach. Nineveh fell, and it didn't just fall. The book of the prophet Nahum describes the destruction with a poetic ferocity that sends chills down the spine. Woe to the bloody city! It is all full of lies and robbery. The prey departeth not. What the Babylonians and the Medes did to Nineveh was so complete, so absolute, that 200 years later, when the Greek general Xenophon passed through the site, he had no idea that that mound of earth was the capital of the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. The largest city in Assyria became a nameless hill in the middle of the desert. It simply vanished from human memory. And it is in this setting, over the rubble of Assyria, over the bones of an empire that terrified the world for 300 years, that Nebuchadnezzar enters history, not as king, not yet, but as the son his father was training to finish the job. Nabopolassar was smart. He knew he had defeated the Assyrians, but the world was not yet his. There was a huge problem called Egypt. Pharaoh Necho II had entered the fray late, trying to save the remnants of the Assyrian Empire, not out of kindness, of course, but because a power vacuum in the Middle East meant someone was going to fill that space, and Egypt preferred to have a weak Assyria as a neighbor rather than a strong Babylon. Necho II had marched north with a massive army and took control of the entire region of Syria and Canaan, including Judah, including Jerusalem. It was during this march that he killed King Josiah of Judah at the Battle of Megiddo in 609 BC. 2 Kings records this moment, the last good king of Judah killed by an Egyptian arrow. From then on, Judah became a puppet of Egypt. Nabopolassar, now old and ill, could not lead a campaign against Egypt personally, so he did something that changed everything. He handed command of the army to his son, the crown prince, Nebuchadnezzar. And here is where the story gets impressive. Nebuchadnezzar was not just the king's son. He was a military genius. And in 605 BC, he proved it in the most brutal way possible. At the Battle of Carchemish, the one I opened this video with, Nebuchadnezzar did not just defeat the Egyptians, he annihilated them. Jeremiah 46:2 describes this battle. The Egyptian army was crushed on the banks of the Euphrates. Those who survived tried to flee, but Nebuchadnezzar pursued the survivors as far as Hamath, hundreds of miles to the south, and destroyed what remained. Necho II himself, the pharaoh who thought he was the heir to the Assyrians, never left Egypt again. 2 Kings 24:7 records with an almost comical coldness. And the king of Egypt came not again any more out of his land, for the king of Babylon had taken from the river of Egypt unto the river Euphrates all that pertained to the king of Egypt. Everything, from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates River. In a single campaign, Nebuchadnezzar was 25 years old, and the whole world was at his feet. But in the middle of this victorious campaign, something happened that tested his character in a way few kings have faced. While Nebuchadnezzar was pursuing the Egyptians, a message arrived from the east. Nabopolassar, his father, had died. The throne of Babylon was empty. And here is the dilemma. Nebuchadnezzar was hundreds of miles from home, in command of the largest army in the world, with the most crushing victory of the decade in his hands. Any delay in returning could mean a rival would seize the throne. But abandoning the army in the field could mean losing everything he had just conquered. The Babylonian records tell us what he did. Nebuchadnezzar handed the army and the prisoners of war over to his generals, took a minimal escort, and crossed the desert by the fastest route possible, straight back to Babylon. He crossed hundreds of miles of desert in a few weeks, and on September 7th, 605 BC, we have the exact date he sat on the throne. Nebuchadnezzar II, king of Babylon. The man who inherited a newborn empire over the ashes of Assyria, and who, over the next 43 years, would transform that empire into something the world had never seen and would never see again. But winning a throne is one thing. Building a civilization is another entirely. And this is where Nebuchadnezzar stops being just another warrior king and becomes something unique in ancient history. because what he did with Babylon has no parallel. Think about this. Most conquering kings spent their resources on war, more territories, more battles, more blood. Nebuchadnezzar waged war, plenty of war, but the heart of his reign was not on the battlefield, it was on the construction sites. The Babylon that Nebuchadnezzar inherited from his father was already a respectable city. Nabopolassar had begun to rebuild it after centuries of Assyrian domination. But what his son did surpassed anything his father could have imagined. Nebuchadnezzar didn't just want a capital, he wanted the greatest city in the world. And he achieved it. Let's start with the walls, because no conversation about Babylon can ignore the walls. Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited Babylon personally around 450 BC, described what he saw with the tone of someone who could hardly believe his own words. He said the outer walls had a perimeter of nearly 90 kilometers. Now, modern historians think Herodotus exaggerated. The most accepted estimate is about 18 kilometers of inner walls, which is already absurd. But the most impressive thing wasn't the length, it was the width. The walls of Babylon were about 26 meters wide at the top. 26 meters. Herodotus says that a chariot pulled by 4 horses could make a full turn on top of the wall. 2 chariots could pass each other going in opposite directions without needing to stop. But here is the detail no one tells you. Walls of Babylon were not just thick, they were a triple defensive system that no army of the time could overcome. The first outer wall was made of baked mud bricks. Behind it, there was a space filled with rubble and compacted earth. And behind that, a second inner wall, even thicker. In front of everything, a deep moat fed by the waters of the Euphrates. To invade Babylon, you would need to cross the moat, climb or destroy the first wall, cross the compacted embankment, and then face the second wall, all while the defenders showered you with arrows, stones, and boiling oil from the platform at the top. No army on the face of the earth had the technology to overcome that in 600 BC. None. If you are impressed by Nebuchadnezzar's military engineering, comment "genius of antiquity," because that is only the surface. And speaking of the surface, the walls were only the shell. What Nebuchadnezzar built inside them would make any visitor question if they were still on the same planet as the rest of humanity. Babylon was cut in half by the Euphrates River. Most ancient cities treated the river as a natural barrier, one half here, one half there, and everyone minds their own business. Nebuchadnezzar looked at that river and said, "I'm going to build a bridge." Sounds simple, right? It wasn't. We are talking about a bridge over the Euphrates, a wide river with a strong current that swelled during the spring floods. The solution the Babylonian engineers found was insane. They temporarily diverted the course of the river, built stone pillars on the dry bed, and then let the water return. The bridge was about 120 meters long, with stone pillars spaced every 6 meters and a floor of cypress and cedar wood so thick it could handle the traffic of loaded wagons. And most impressively, according to Herodotus, the floorboards were removed at night to prevent thieves from crossing from one side of the city to the other in the dark. But the bridge was just infrastructure. The real spectacle was visual. Nebuchadnezzar coated entire buildings with glazed bricks in cobalt blue, golden yellow, and white. You need to stop and process this. In an era when most of the world's cities were brown, mud, stone, dust, all in a lifeless tone, Babylon shone in colors that seemed impossible. The Ishtar Gate, the city's main ceremonial entrance, was covered in deep blue glazed bricks with reliefs of bulls and dragons in yellow and white. This gate was 14 meters high, taller than a 4-story building, and when the sun hit those glazed bricks, the entire entrance looked like it was made of sapphire. Today, you can see a reconstruction of the Ishtar Gate at the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. even reconstructed, even inside a museum with artificial lighting. The visual impact is so strong that visitors stop in silence when they enter the room. Now imagine seeing the original under the Mesopotamian sun, with processions of priests passing beneath it, the sound of drums and chants echoing through the streets, and the smell of incense rising from dozens of altars. The experience must have been overwhelming. The Processional Way, the avenue that passed through the Ishtar Gate and cut through the center of the city, was more than 20 meters wide. The walls on both sides were lined with the same blue glazed bricks and decorated with 120 lions in relief, each nearly 2 meters long, made of molded bricks glazed in yellow, brown, and red. 120 lions, 60 on each side. Imagine walking down this avenue for the first time, a foreign ambassador, a prisoner of war, a merchant from the other side of the world, and seeing this endless row of lions roaring in silence against that impossible blue background. The message was clear, without needing a single word. You are entering the center of the universe. Behave accordingly. And now comes a part that will shock you. Babylon had a sewage system. That's right. In 600 BC, while Europe would be throwing trash and waste out the window for the next 2,000 years, Nebuchadnezzar's engineers had already designed covered drains that ran beneath the main streets and dumped waste into the river, downstream from the city. There was a storm drainage system. There were ceramic gutters connecting houses to the main galleries. We are talking about planned basic sanitation at a level that Rome would only reach centuries later, and that medieval Europe simply forgot was possible. But what truly put Babylon on the map, what made it one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, were the hanging gardens. And here the story gets personal, because tradition says that Nebuchadnezzar did not build the gardens out of pride or for propaganda. He built them for love. Nebuchadnezzar's wife, a Median princess named Amytis, had grown up in the green and flowery mountains of Media, in what is now northwestern Iran. When she arrived in Babylon, she found a flat, dry, brown plain stretching to the horizon. No mountains, no forests, none of the green she had known since childhood. She became homesick. And Nebuchadnezzar, the man who commanded the largest army in the world, the man who had crushed Egypt and who was about to destroy Jerusalem, this man looked at his wife's sadness and decided to bring the mountains to her. The hanging gardens were an artificial structure of tiered terraces, one on top of the other, each level filled with trees, flowers, and plants brought from all parts of the empire. Ancient historians describe the structure as an artificial green mountain in the middle of the Mesopotamian plain, visible for miles, defying everything that the nature and engineering of that time allowed. Water was pumped from the Euphrates to the top by a system of screws, possibly Archimedes' screws, centuries before Archimedes received credit for the invention. The water cascaded from terrace to terrace, irrigating each level and creating the constant sound of running water in the middle of the desert. It's beautiful, isn't it? An all-powerful king building an artificial mountain to cure his wife's homesickness. It's almost romantic, but make no mistake, Nebuchadnezzar was no poet. He was a predator. And while he built gardens for his wife, he was systematically planning the destruction of every kingdom that dared to challenge him, including a small kingdom in the mountains of Judea that was about to make the worst diplomatic mistake in its history. Because here is what few people understand about Nebuchadnezzar. He didn't wake up one day and decide to destroy Jerusalem on a whim. He didn't hate the Jews. He had nothing against Solomon's temple. The destruction of Jerusalem was the final result of a chain of stupid decisions, diplomatic betrayals, and failed political bets, almost all of them made by the kings of Judah themselves. Nebuchadnezzar gave chances, more than one, and they were all thrown away. But this part of the story, the part that explains how and why Jerusalem died, is so dense, so full of twists that it deserves to be told slowly. And that is exactly what we are going to do now. To understand the destruction of Jerusalem, You need to understand the political situation of Judah at that time. And the situation was, in a word, pathetic. Judah in 605 BC was a tiny kingdom. We are talking about a territory smaller than a small US state, squeezed between arid mountains and the Negev desert, with a population that perhaps reached 120,000 people. For comparison, the city of Babylon alone had more people than the entire kingdom of Judah. Jerusalem, the capital, the city of the temple, the city of David, was smaller than a neighborhood in Babylon. And this tiny kingdom was stuck in the worst possible geographical location, exactly in the corridor between two giant empires. To the north and east, Babylon. To the southwest, Egypt. Judah was the mat between two doors, and both doors were slamming. When Nebuchadnezzar crushed Egypt at Carchemish, the shockwave was felt immediately in Jerusalem. The king of Judah at that time was Jehoiachin, and the story of how he came to the throne already says everything about Judah's situation. Jehoiachin was not chosen by the people. He was not anointed by a prophet. He was placed on the throne by Pharaoh Necho II, who had killed the previous king, Josiah, and then deposed Josiah's son, Jehoahaz, whom the people had chosen. Necho even changed the guy's name from Eliakim to Jehoiakim, just to make it clear who was in charge. Jehoiakim was an Egyptian puppet, and suddenly Egypt had been wiped off the military map. What did Jehoiakim do? The only thing he could do, he prostrated himself before Nebuchadnezzar. When the Babylonian armies swept through Syria and down the Mediterranean coast, collecting the submission of every city and every king in the region, Jehoiakim opened the gates, paid tribute, and swore loyalty. 2 Kings 24:1 records bluntly, "In his days Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant 3 years. And it was at this moment, 605 BC, that the first wave of deportees left Jerusalem for Babylon. It wasn't a mass exile, not yet. Nebuchadnezzar did something much more calculated. He took the best. The book of Daniel opens exactly with this scene. Daniel 1:3-4 describes Nebuchadnezzar's order to the chief of his eunuchs. Bring young men of the nobility of Judah without physical defect, handsome, intelligent, instructed, capable of serving in the king's palace. Nebuchadnezzar wasn't punishing Judah, he was harvesting, taking the brains, the future leaders, the children of the elite, and transplanting them all to Babylon, where they would be re-educated, renamed, and absorbed by the empire. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, whom you probably know by their Babylonian names, Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were part of this first deportation. Teenagers plucked from Jerusalem, taken on foot for a march of more than 1,500 kilometers across the desert to be transformed into Babylonians. And this is a detail most people don't realize when they read the book of Daniel. Daniel didn't go to Babylon after the destruction of Jerusalem. He arrived almost 20 years earlier. He saw everything happen from afar, receiving news of every disastrous decision the kings of Judah made in the years that followed. Because Jehoiakim, that puppet who swore loyalty to whoever was strongest, did the stupidest thing he could do. After 3 years of paying tribute to Babylon, he rebelled. He stopped paying. He turned his back on Nebuchadnezzar. And why? Because Egypt was whispering in his ear. The Pharaoh promised military aid, promised protection, promised that together they could face Babylon. The prophet Jeremiah warned him. He shouted, he pleaded. The entire 22nd chapter of Jeremiah is a desperate prophecy. He describes Jehoiakim as a king who built his palace with injustice, who used forced labor from his own people, who covered himself in cedar and vermilion while the kingdom sank. Jeremiah said to Jehoiakim's face, "You will die with no one to cry for you. They will drag your body and throw it outside the gates of Jerusalem like someone throwing away the carcass of a donkey. And what did Jehoiakim do with Jeremiah's prophecy? Jeremiah 36 tells this scene with cinematic detail. Jeremiah dictated his prophecies to the scribe Baruch, who wrote them on a scroll. The scroll was read in the temple. Palace officials heard it, were terrified, and took the scroll to the king. It was winter. Jehoiakim was sitting in his winter quarters with a brazier of fire burning before him. An official began to read the scroll aloud, and every 3 or 4 columns the official read, Jehoiakim took a scribe's knife, cut off the piece that had been read, and threw it into the fire. He cut and burned. He cut and burned, until the entire scroll, the words of God, according to Jeremiah, turned to ash in the brazier. The text says that Jehoiakim was not afraid, nor rent his garments, a phrase that only makes sense when you understand that rending one's garments was the universal gesture of repentance and horror. Jehoiakim felt nothing. He burned the prophecy with the same indifference as someone throwing wrapping paper in the trash. And then he ordered Jeremiah and Baruch to be arrested. The two escaped. The biblical text says dryly that the Lord hid them. Nebuchadnezzar did not respond to Jehoiakim's rebellion immediately, and this is important. He didn't send his main army right away. First, he sent bands of Chaldeans, Arameans, Moabites, and Ammonites, smaller forces, quick strike groups, to harass Judah and test its defenses. It was like a cat playing with a mouse. Nebuchadnezzar wanted Jehoiakim to feel fear before the final blow. He wanted him to call Egypt for help and see that Egypt would not come. And Egypt did not come. Of course it didn't. Necho II's Egypt was licking its wounds from Carchemish. It wasn't going to risk another army against Nebuchadnezzar to save an irrelevant little king in the mountains of Judea. In 598 BC, Nebuchadnezzar finally lost his patience. He gathered his main army and marched personally against Jerusalem. And here, history takes a curious turn. Jehoiakim died before Nebuchadnezzar arrived. How he died, no one knows for sure. 2 Kings 24:6 says only that Jehoiakim slept with his fathers, the standard biblical formula for a natural death. But Jeremiah had prophesied that he would have the burial of a donkey dragged and thrown outside the walls. Some historians think he was murdered by his own courtiers in a desperate attempt to appease Nebuchadnezzar before it was too late. Others think he died of disease at the worst possible moment. Either way, the throne fell into his son's lap. Jehoiachin, 18 years old, king for 3 months, and the most powerful army in the world was camped outside the walls of Jerusalem. Think of this boy's situation. He didn't ask to be king. He had no time to rule, to learn, to form alliances. He inherited a suicidal rebellion that his father had started and didn't have the decency to finish. And now, at 18, Jehoiachin had 2 options: fight to the death against Nebuchadnezzar and guarantee the total destruction of Jerusalem, or surrender and pray that Nebuchadnezzar would show some mercy. Jehoiachin chose to surrender. 2 Kings describes the scene. And Jehoiachin, the king of Judah, went out to the king of Babylon, he and his mother and his servants and his princes and his officers. He went out. That is the key word. He opened the gates and walked toward the enemy army. Imagine this image: a royal teenager, probably trembling, walking through the Kidron Valley toward Nebuchadnezzar's tents, with his mother at his side, surrounded by the same officials who had advised his father to rebel and who now had to face the consequences. Nebuchadnezzar accepted the surrender, but this time the price was much higher than in 605. This time, he emptied Jerusalem. The Book of Kings lists what Nebuchadnezzar took, and every line is a blow. He took the treasures of the temple of the Lord. He took the treasures of the royal palace. He cut into pieces all the gold vessels that Solomon had made for the temple. Every piece, every lampstand, every basin, every sacred object that had survived 400 years. And then the human numbers. He deported 10,000 people, all the princes, all the warriors, all the blacksmiths and craftsmen. 2 Kings is almost brutal in its precision. None remained, save the poorest sort of the people of the land. 10,000 people, chained, marching east. Men, women, children of the Jerusalem elite, walking 1,500 kilometers through the desert to Babylon. Among them was Jehoiachin himself, the young king who surrendered to save the city. He would spend the next 37 years imprisoned in Babylon. 37 years. He entered as a teenage king and left as a white-haired old man, released only when Nebuchadnezzar was already dead and a new Babylonian king decided to let him see the sun. And the prophet Ezekiel? He went in this wave, the man who would have the strangest and most disturbing visions in all of the Old Testament. Wheels within wheels, dry bones coming back to life, a temple that no one ever built, was plucked from Jerusalem in 597 BC and sat on the bank of the Chebar canal in Babylon, from where he saw the glory of God depart from the temple even before it was destroyed. Ezekiel knew. Before everyone else, he knew what was coming next. But Nebuchadnezzar, despite having emptied Jerusalem of everything of value, gold, silver, craftsmen, soldiers, nobility, did not destroy it. He didn't burn the temple. He didn't tear down the walls. He did something that shows an almost clinical imperial logic. He placed a puppet on the throne. Jehoiachin's uncle, a man Nebuchadnezzar personally chose and renamed from Mattaniah to Zedekiah. The new name meant justice of the Lord, a bitter irony considering what this man would do in the years to follow. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he received the throne, but received his too generous word. He didn't receive a kingdom, he received a skeleton. Jerusalem had been emptied, the best warriors deported, the craftsmen taken, the royal treasury looted, the temple stripped of everything that shone. Zedekiah reigned over a city of the poor and a territory of widows. And yet, even looking at the empty gates and the clean vaults, Zedekiah managed to make the same mistake as his brother Jehoiachin. He rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, and this time there was no chance of mercy. But before we continue with the destruction of Jerusalem, which is, without exaggeration, one of the most terrible scenes in the entire Bible, we need to stop and look at the other side of this story. Because while Judah bled, while Jerusalem lost its layers one by one, like an onion being peeled, something extraordinary was happening inside Babylon. The exiles, those 10,000 deported in 597 and the young nobles taken in 605, were not rotting in dungeons, they were living, and this is where the story of Nebuchadnezzar becomes much more complicated than any simple narrative of villain and hero allows. Because Nebuchadnezzar did not treat his deportees as slaves. This goes against everything popular culture has taught you, but the archaeological records are clear. In 1893, German excavators found on the outskirts of Babylon an archive of more than 300 cuneiform tablets that became known as the Babylonian ration texts. These tablets were administrative lists, bureaucratic records of food distributed by the government to different groups of people living in the city. And among the names listed on these tablets, one appeared that made archaeologists fall out of their chairs. Jehoiachin, king of the land of Yahud. Jehoiachin, king of Judah. There he was, the exiled king, recorded in Nebuchadnezzar's administrative archives, receiving regular rations of oil and grain from the Babylonian government. It wasn't a dungeon, it was a kind of golden prison, or at least a prison that was fed. And Jehoiachin wasn't the only one. The tablets mention sons of the king of Judah, Jewish craftsmen, and dozens of other deportees from different nations, all receiving rations from the state. Does this change the narrative? Not completely. Forced deportation is still forced deportation. Tearing people from their land, from their temples, from their buried dead. This doesn't become humane just because you give the prisoner food. But it shows that Nebuchadnezzar was not the irrational monster many imagine. He had a system, The deportees were an investment. The craftsmen worked on construction projects. The intellectuals served in the administration. The young nobles were re-educated to serve the empire. It was cruel, yes, but it was cruelty with a purpose, not for pleasure. Psalm 137 captures the pain of these exiles with an honesty that tears at the soul. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. The Babylonian guards asked the Jews to sing the songs of Zion, perhaps as entertainment, perhaps with genuine curiosity. And the exiles responded with a question that echoes to this day. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? But while the exiles wept by the rivers of Babylon, back in Jerusalem, Zedekiah was cooking up the final disaster. And Zedekiah's tragedy is that he wasn't a bad man. He was a weak man. Jeremiah 38 shows this with painful clarity. Zedekiah would call Jeremiah in secret, hidden from his own officials, and ask, "Is there any word from the Lord?" He wanted to hear from God. He wanted to do the right thing, but he didn't have the spine to actually do it. Jeremiah told him repeatedly, with a simplicity that left no room for interpretation, "Surrender to Nebuchadnezzar and you will live. Your family will live and the city will not be burned. Refuse and everything dies." That was the message. No codes, no metaphors, no ambiguity. Surrender and live, resist and die. But Zedekiah's officials, the nobles who had stayed behind, the second line left after Nebuchadnezzar took the best, pushed in the opposite direction. They looked south to Egypt and saw salvation. The new pharaoh, Apries, was promising troops. Emissaries went back and forth between Jerusalem and the Nile Delta. And slowly, methodically, Zedekiah was dragged into rebellion. In the 9th year of his reign, 588 BC, Zedekiah stopped paying tribute to Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar, for the third and final time, marched on Jerusalem. Only this time he didn't come to loot, he didn't come to deport, he didn't come to put another puppet on the throne. This time, Nebuchadnezzar came to erase Jerusalem from the map. And what happened over the next 18 months is one of the most terrible stories the ancient world ever produced. A siege so brutal, so long, so suffocating, that the people inside the walls of Jerusalem reached a point that human beings should never reach. But this story, the siege, the famine, the fall, the fire, the temple in flames, needs to be told right. Because the details matter. Every detail matters, and it is the details that transform a date in a history book into something you feel in your stomach. January 588 BC, Nebuchadnezzar's army surrounded Jerusalem. And when I say surrounded, I'm not talking about soldiers standing around looking at the walls. The Babylonians built siege ramps, assault towers, and a wall around the entire city. A siege wall around the walls. In Hebrew, the word is dayek. It was a physical barrier that prevented anyone from entering or leaving. No food came in, no water came in, no messenger left. Jerusalem became a sealed box with tens of thousands of people inside, and the only thing Nebuchadnezzar had to do was wait. And he knew how to wait. Nebuchadnezzar was patient the way a vulture is patient. He didn't need to break down the gates as long as hunger did the work for him. And the hunger came. It came slowly, as it always does. First, the luxuries ran out. Then the grain ran out. Then the animals. Then the things no human being should ever consider as food. The Book of Lamentations, attributed to Jeremiah, the man who had warned that all this would happen, describes the famine with a precision you feel in your throat. Lamentations 4:4. The tongue of the sucking child cleaveth to the roof of his mouth for thirst. The young children ask bread, and no man breaketh it unto them. Lamentations 4:8. Their visage is blacker than a coal. They are not known in the streets. Their skin cleaveth to their bones. It is withered. It is become like a stick. And then comes the verse that no one wants to read aloud, Lamentations 4:10. The hands of the pitiful women have sodden their own children. They were their meat in the destruction of the daughter of my people. Cannibalism. Mothers eating their own children. Jeremiah isn't making it up. Deuteronomy 28, written centuries earlier, had already prophesied that this would happen if Israel abandoned its covenant. Moses described in horrifying detail that under siege, men and women would look at their own children and see food. When Jeremiah wrote Lamentations, he wasn't writing poetry. He was writing a report. And in the middle of this siege, something happened that almost changed everything. The Egyptian army appeared. Pharaoh Apris, the one who had promised help, finally sent troops north. And when the Babylonian lookout spotted the dust column of the Egyptian army rising from the coastal plain, Nebuchadnezzar did something unexpected. He lifted the siege. Temporarily, he took his army away from the walls of Jerusalem and marched to confront the Egyptians before they got close. And inside Jerusalem, for a brief moment, people breathed. The gates opened, food came in, the pressure eased. Zedekiah's officials, the same ones who had pushed the king into rebellion, now pointed to the horizon and said, "See, we were right. Egypt came. Babylon fled." Jeremiah was not impressed. Jeremiah 37:7-10 records the message he sent to Zedekiah at that moment. Thus saith the Lord, Behold, Pharaoh's army, which is come forth to help you, shall return to Egypt into their own land. And the Chaldeans shall come again, and fight against this city, and take it and burn it with fire. And Jeremiah added something that is almost absurd, its categorical nature. For though ye had smitten the whole army of the Chaldeans that fight against you, and there remained but wounded men among them, yet should they rise up every man in his tent and burn this city with fire. It was impossible to escape. Even if the Babylonians were all wounded, they would crawl to Jerusalem to destroy it. That was the level of inevitability Jeremiah was communicating, and he was right. The confrontation with Egypt lasted days, perhaps weeks, but the result was exactly what Nebuchadnezzar expected and Jeremiah prophesied. The Egyptian army saw the Babylonians marching in formation, calculated the odds, and went home. No fight, no epic battle, nothing. Apris simply turned around and vanished behind the Sinai, leaving Jerusalem completely alone. Nebuchadnezzar's army returned. They rebuilt the ramps, they closed the siege wall, and they tightened the knot. What happened to Jeremiah during this interval deserves to be told, because it shows the kind of madness that dominated Jerusalem in its final days. When the siege was briefly lifted, Jeremiah tried to leave the city to go to the territory of Benjamin to settle a land matter. At the city gate, a guard official arrested him, accusing him of deserting to the Babylonians. Jeremiah denied it. It is false. I fall not away to the Chaldeans, but he was beaten and thrown into a cistern converted into a prison in the house of an official named Jonathan. He stayed there for days, weeks. Zedekiah sent for him in secret, again in secret, always in secret, because the king was afraid of his own officials, and asked, "Is there any word from the Lord?" And Jeremiah, even imprisoned, even beaten, said the same thing he always said. "There is, for," said he, "thou shalt be delivered into the hand of the king of Babylon." Zedekiah didn't send Jeremiah back to Jonathan's cistern, at least he had that much decency, but transferred him to the court of the guard. Still a prisoner, but in the open air. And from there, Jeremiah continued preaching, surrender. Whoever goes out and surrenders to the Babylonians will live. Whoever stays in the city will die by the sword, famine, or pestilence. This message infuriated the military officials. To them, Jeremiah was a traitor, an infiltrated Babylonian agent, a man who weakened the morale of the troops and the people. And they did something terrible. Jeremiah 38:6. They took Jeremiah and cast him into the dungeon of Malchiah the son of Hamelech. There was no water in the dungeon. only mire, and Jeremiah sank in the mire. Imagine an elderly man, a prophet who spent his whole life warning that this would happen, buried up to his waist in sludge at the bottom of a dark hole, waiting for death. He would have died there. But an Ethiopian official from the palace, a man named Ebed-Melech, a foreigner, an African in the court of Judah, went to the king and said, "My lord the king, these men have done evil in all that they have done to Jeremiah the prophet. He is like to die for hunger in the place where he is." And Zedekiah, the weak king, who couldn't make a decision without trembling, said, "Take from hence 30 men with thee, and take up Jeremiah the prophet out of the dungeon before he die." Ebed-Melech went down with ropes and old rags. The biblical text specifies old rags, so the ropes wouldn't hurt Jeremiah's armpits, and pulled the prophet out of the mud. 30 men and old rags. While the city died of hunger, while the walls shook with the impact of Babylonian battering rams, an Ethiopian whose name no one remembers saved the life of Israel's most unpopular prophet with a gesture of humanity so simple it almost doesn't seem to belong in this story. And Jeremiah survived. He survived the siege, survived the fall, survived the destruction. He will live long enough to write Lamentations, the saddest poem ever composed in Hebrew, sitting among the smoking rubble of everything he had warned would fall. The siege lasted 18 months, and on the 9th day of the 4th month of the 11th year of Zedekiah, July 586 BC by our count, the Babylonians breached the walls. The earth ramps they had built for months finally reached the top. The battering rams broke the stone, and Nebuchadnezzar's soldiers entered through a point in the northern wall near the middle gate and spread through the city like water through a burst dam. 2 Kings 25:4 records what happened next, and the city was broken up, and all the men of war fled by night by the way of the gate between two walls, which is by the king's garden. Now the Chaldees were against the city round about. By night, the Jewish soldiers fled by night through the back door, while the Babylonians entered through the front, and Zedekiah went with them. Think about this: the king, the man who swore to protect Jerusalem, who rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, promising he would fight, who ignored Jeremiah, who listened to the officials, who received promises from Egypt, fled by night through the back door. He left the civilian population to face the most brutal army in the world alone. Zedekiah ran toward the Jordan Valley, probably trying to cross the river and disappear into Transjordan. But the Babylonian army caught up with him on the plains of Jericho. His soldiers scattered. They abandoned the king. And Zedekiah was captured alone, or nearly alone, running through the same plain where Joshua, centuries earlier, had entered the Promised Land with trumpets and the Ark of the Covenant. They took him to Nebuchadnezzar. And here the biblical text reaches a level of cruelty that is hard to read without looking away. Nebuchadnezzar was in Riblah, in Syria, his campaign headquarters. Zedekiah was brought before him, and Nebuchadnezzar pronounced judgment. 2 Kings 25:7. And they slew the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. He made the king watch his own sons being executed, one by one. He made him see, and after he saw, after the last image burned into Zedekiah's eyes, was the blood of his sons on the hard-packed earth of Riblah. The Babylonians put out his eyes. They blinded him. The last thing Zedekiah saw in this world was the death of his lineage. Nebuchadnezzar wasn't just punishing, he was building a monument of horror in the mind of every vassal king who might think of rebelling. The message was clear. This is what happens. They bound Zedekiah with fetters of brass and carried him to Babylon, where he died in prison, blind, childless, throneless, with nothing. A month after the breach in the walls, on the 7th day of the 5th month according to Kings, or the 10th day according to Jeremiah, Nebuzaradan arrived in Jerusalem. Nebuzaradan was the captain of Nebuchadnezzar's personal guard, the commander sent to execute the final sentence. And what he did in Jerusalem was systematic, methodical, total. He burned the temple of the Lord. He burned the royal palace. He burned every great house in the city. The text says every great man's house. It wasn't random destruction. It was directed demolition. The structures of power, the symbols of identity, the places that made Jerusalem be Jerusalem. Everything turned to fire. Solomon's temple, the house that had taken 7 years to build, made with stones cut at the quarry so that no hammer would be heard on the construction site. The place where the Ark of the Covenant rested, where the glory of God had descended like a cloud on the day of dedication 4 centuries earlier. The bronze pillars named Jachin and Boaz, each 8 meters high and nearly 2 meters in diameter, were broken into pieces. The 10 bronze bases, the bronze sea, that massive basin supported by 12 metal bulls that stood in the temple courtyard, everything was shattered and the bronze carried to Babylon. 2 Kings 25 spends entire verses listing every piece of bronze, every shovel, every snuffer, every basin, as if the author couldn't stop cataloguing what was lost, as if the list itself were a form of mourning. And after the structures, the people. Nebuzaradan arrested the high priest Sariah and the second priest Zephaniah. He arrested the 3 keepers of the temple threshold. He arrested the military official who commanded the men of war, 5 personal advisors to the king who were found hiding in the city, the scribe of the army commander, and 60 common men. He took them all to Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah, and Nebuchadnezzar executed them, all of them. The text is dry. And the king of Babylon smote them and slew them at Riblah in the land of Hamath. Then comes the final sentence of 2 Kings, and it weighs like a tombstone. So Judah was carried away out of their land. Judah ended, not as a metaphor, as a fact. The kingdom that David had founded, that Solomon had covered in gold, that had survived Assyrian invasions, civil wars, good kings and terrible kings. This kingdom ceased to exist in July 586 BC. The walls of Jerusalem were torn down. The temple was a rectangle of ash. The throne of David was empty. And on the dusty roads leading out of the destroyed city, a long column of deportees walked east toward Babylon, leaving behind a silence so deep that Jeremiah compared Jerusalem to a widow. How doth the city sit solitary that was full of people? How is she become as a widow? She that was great among the nations. Nebuchadnezzar had finally finished with Judah. 3 invasions, 3 deposed kings, 3 deportations, in 605, in 597, and now in 586. 20 years of progressively less patience, 20 years of chances given and wasted until no more chances were left to give. But here is the question that is rarely asked, and that changes everything when you consider it. Why did Nebuchadnezzar take so long? Any other emperor of the ancient world would have destroyed Jerusalem at the first rebellion. The Assyrians would have. Sargon II destroyed Samaria and deported the entire kingdom of Israel in 722, and those 10 tribes never returned. Nebuchadnezzar gave Judah 20 years and 3 chances. Why? The simplest answer is probably the correct one. Judah wasn't worth the effort of destruction. It was more useful intact, paying tribute, serving as a buffer state between Babylon and Egypt. Nebuchadnezzar only destroyed Jerusalem when it became clear that keeping it intact cost more than eliminating it. It wasn't anger, it was imperial accounting. And now, with Judah erased and the entire Levant under his control, Nebuchadnezzar could finally focus on what he really wanted to do. Because war was only half of this man's story, perhaps not even half. Nebuchadnezzar didn't want to be remembered as a destroyer. He wanted to be remembered as a builder. And what he built inside Babylon makes the destruction of Jerusalem look like a footnote in history. Babylon. Just the name already carried weight in the ancient world. But the Babylon that Nebuchadnezzar inherited from his father was not the Babylon he would leave to history. When Nabopolassar died in 605, the city was already impressive. It was the capital of a new empire, built on the ruins of a metropolis that the Assyrians had razed and rebuilt several times. But Nebuchadnezzar looked at that city and saw a draft. He saw potential. He saw the floor plan of something the world had never seen and perhaps will never see again. And during the 43 years of his reign, he transformed Babylon into the largest city on planet Earth. This is not hyperbole. It is not narrator exaggeration. It is the consensus of modern archaeology. Between approximately 600 and 560 BC, Babylon was the largest, most populous, and most spectacular city that existed on the face of the earth. No other came close. Let's start with the walls, because that is where any visitor began to understand what Nebuchadnezzar had done. Babylon had a system of double walls, in some sections triple, that surrounded an area of near 9 square kilometers. The outer wall, called Imgur Enlil, was 7 meters thick. The inner wall, called Nemeti Enlil, was nearly 8 meters. Between the two, there was a space that could be filled with earth to create an elevated combat platform. And at regular intervals, every 20 meters or so, watchtowers projected from the walls. Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited Babylon about a century after Nebuchadnezzar, wrote that the wall was so wide at the top that 2 quadrigas, 2 4-horse chariots, could pass each other side by side. Modern historians have debated whether Herodotus exaggerated. He probably did a little. But Robert Koldewey's excavations in the early 20th century confirmed that the walls were real. They were massive, and they were made of baked bricks joined with bitumen, the natural asphalt that bubbled from the Mesopotamian soil, and gave Babylonian construction a durability that the ancient world could not replicate. But the walls were just the frame. What was inside them was what mattered. And inside them, the first thing that hit the visitor was the Processional Way, the central avenue of Babylon, which cut through the city from north to south like an artery of stone and color. The Processional Way was more than 20 meters wide. The pavement was made of white and red limestone slabs, each slab inscribed on the underside with a dedication from Nebuchadnezzar, invisible to those who walked over it, visible only to the gods looking from below. And the walls lining the avenue were coated in deep blue glazed bricks, lapis lazuli blue, desert sky blue at noon, with figures of lions in relief. Lions walking, lions on the march, 60 lions on each side, 120 in all, each more than 2 meters long, molded in ceramic bricks glazed in yellow, white, and ochre against that impossible blue background. Each lion was the symbol of Ishtar, the goddess of war and love, and each lion was marching in the same direction, south, toward the heart of the city, as if escorting whoever walked down that avenue into the presence of the gods. And at the end of the Processional Way, or the beginning, depending on where you started, stood the Ishtar Gate. If you have never seen the Ishtar Gate, look for a photo. Better yet, if you ever go to Berlin, go to the Pergamon Museum, because that is where it is. Koldewey unearthed the fragments between 1902 and 1914, and the museum reconstructed the gate in its full size, 14 meters high, blue, all blue, glazed cobalt blue, shining under the light as if it were painted yesterday. And over the blue, alternating rows of bulls and dragons, the bulls of Adad, god of the storm, and the Mushussu, the dragon serpents of Marduk, the supreme god of Babylon. Each animal molded in relief, each covered in yellow and white enamel that stood out against the blue like constellations in the night sky. 575 animals in all. When you stand before that gate in the museum, reconstructed, fragmented, reassembled from thousands of shards, it still takes your breath away. Imagine what it was like to see it whole, new, glistening under the Mesopotamian sun, with the smell of incense coming from the temples behind it and the sound of ceremonial drums echoing down the processional way. Imagine being a foreign ambassador, a vassal king, a prisoner of war, arriving at that gate for the first time. You would immediately understand the message. You are small. This is big. Act accordingly. Beyond the Ishtar Gate, Nebuchadnezzar built, or massively rebuilt, the Esagila, the Temple of Marduk, and the Etemenanki, the ziggurat of Babylon. And here we need to stop for a moment because the Etemenanki is probably the most famous building that most people don't know existed. Etemenanki. In Sumerian, the name means the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. It was a ziggurat, a stepped pyramid, an artificial mountain made of bricks, and it stood at the center of Babylon's sacred complex, west of the Esagila. Nebuchadnezzar was not the first to build it. The Etemenanki had a history that went back centuries, perhaps millennia, destroyed and rebuilt several times, like almost everything in Mesopotamia. But Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt it on the ultimate scale. A cuneiform tablet found in the 19th century, known as the Esagila tablet, gives the dimensions. The base was 91 meters on each side, 91 by 91 meters, nearly a hectare just for the base. And the total height, according to estimates based on that same tablet, was equivalent to the width of the base, 91 meters. A square tower 90 meters high in the middle of the flattest alluvial plain in the world, where the horizon is a straight line in every direction. You could see the Etemenanki from dozens of kilometers away. It was the first thing that appeared when you traveled toward Babylon. A geometric shadow on the horizon, growing with every step, until you realized the scale and your brain refused to accept that human hands had stacked that there. And yes, if you are thinking what I think you are thinking, you are probably right. The Tower of Babel. Genesis 11 describes a tower whose top would reach the heavens, built in the land of Shinar, the biblical name for Mesopotamia. Most scholars agree that the story of the Tower of Babel is, at the very least, inspired by Mesopotamian ziggurats, and the Etemenanki is the most likely candidate. The name Babel is the Hebrew form of Bab-Ilim, Gate of the Gods, which is the name of Babylon itself. The connection is not subtle, it is not an obscure theory. The biblical text is looking directly at Babylon and saying, that tower, that ambition to touch the sky, that arrogance, we know what God thinks of that. Nebuchadnezzar, when he restored the Etemenanki, left inscriptions declaring, I raised the top of the Etemenanki so that it might compete with the heavens. The language is almost identical to Genesis. Compete with the heavens, touch the heavens, and the author of Genesis, possibly writing or editing during the Babylonian exile, when deported Jews lived in the literal shadow of this tower, looked up and saw exactly what Nebuchadnezzar wanted everyone to see. The power of Babylon materialized in brick and bitumen, rising toward the gods. But Nebuchadnezzar didn't just build for the gods, he built for himself. The palace complex he erected in the northwest corner of the inner city was a structure of obscene dimensions. Koldewey identified 5 main courtyards connected by corridors and audience halls, the largest of them, the throne room, 52 meters long by 17 wide. The outer walls of the throne room were decorated with the same blue glazed bricks as the Ishtar Gate, with stylized palm trees and floral figures in yellow-white. The room where Nebuchadnezzar received ambassadors, tributaries, and defeated kings was, in itself, a declaration. You are entering the center of the world. All the luxury, all the color, all the scale exists so that you understand that the person sitting on the throne before you is not a man like other men. He is the chosen of Marduk. He is the son of Babylon. Bow down. And then there are the hanging gardens. And here the story gets complicated because the Hanging Gardens of Babylon are one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the only one that has never been located with certainty. Greek and Roman authors describe the gardens in dazzling detail. Strabo wrote that they were elevated terraces, supported by arches and columns, irrigated by Archimedes screws that pumped water from the Euphrates to the top. Diodorus Siculus described large trees planted on platforms 20 meters high, creating the illusion of a green mountain in the middle of the plain. The most popular legend, told by Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek in the 3rd century BC, said that Nebuchadnezzar built the gardens for his wife Amytis, a Median princess who missed the green mountains of her homeland and was depressed by the flat, dusty landscape of Mesopotamia. It's a beautiful story. It's a romantic story. It's the kind of story that sticks in the memory and never leaves. The problem is that no Babylonian inscription, not one, mentions the gardens. Nebuchadnezzar left dozens of inscriptions describing his constructions in exhaustive detail. Every temple restored, every wall reinforced, every canal dug. He lists everything, except the gardens. Koldewey excavated Babylon for 18 years and found a structure with 14 vaulted rooms and a well that could have been a hydraulic system, and suggested they were the gardens. But most modern archaeologists are not convinced. In 2013, Assyriologist Stephanie Daly published a book arguing that the Hanging Gardens did exist, but not in Babylon. According to Daly, the gardens were built by Sennacherib in Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, more than a century before Nebuchadnezzar. Assyrian inscriptions describe an elevated garden with a sophisticated hydraulic system, and Nineveh, unlike Babylon, was in a region with enough hills and rivers to support this type of structure. The confusion would have occurred because later Greek authors frequently confused Nineveh with Babylon. Both were Mesopotamian metropolises, both were legendary, and when Nineveh was destroyed in 612, its fame was gradually absorbed by that of Babylon. If Daly is right, and many experts find the argument strong, then the Hanging Gardens of Babylon are the greatest misattribution in the history of architecture. Nebuchadnezzar took the credit for something an Assyrian king built. The irony is almost poetic. The man who destroyed the Assyrian legacy ended up inheriting even the wonder they built. But even without the Hanging Gardens, what Nebuchadnezzar built is staggering, because he didn't just build in Babylon. He built Babylon. He rebuilt the Temple of Shamash in Sippar, the Temple of Nabu in Borsippa, the Temple of Sin in Ur, the same Ur from which Abraham had departed 1,000 years earlier. He dug canals. He reinforced dikes along the Euphrates to control the floods that could destroy an entire harvest in a matter of days. He built a defensive wall north of Babylon, the Median Wall, as it was called, that stretched between the Euphrates and the Tigris, creating a barrier against invasions from the north. Each project had an inscription. Each inscription began the same way: I, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the faithful shepherd, the eternal chosen of Marduk, and then listed what he had done, brick by brick, canal by canal, temple by temple. The volume of construction is almost incomprehensible for an age without machines, without steel, without reinforced concrete. Millions of bricks, each molded by hand, dried in the sun or baked in a kiln, carried on the backs of workers to the exact spot where it would be laid. And here is the detail that reveals more about Nebuchadnezzar than any battle or siege. On many of the bricks of Babylon, thousands of them, perhaps millions, there is an inscription stamped into the clay before it was baked. Every brick carries the king's name: Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, provider of the Esagila and the Ezida, firstborn son of Nabopolassar, king of Babylon. Every single brick. You can go to museums today, the Louvre, the British Museum, the Metropolitan, and hold in your hand a brick 2,600 years old with Nebuchadnezzar's name pressed into the clay. He literally wrote his name in the atoms of the city. Every wall, every temple, every pavement trodden by priests and slaves and merchants and soldiers carried those words. Nebuchadnezzar wasn't just building a city, he was building his own immortality. And it worked. 2,600 years later, we are here talking about him, holding his bricks, reading his name. But while Nebuchadnezzar was piling up bricks and engraving his name on each of them, something was happening on the banks of the canals of Babylon that he probably never noticed. Something silent, something that no army could stop, no wall could contain, and no inscription could record. Because in the neighborhoods where the Jewish deportees had been settled, on the banks of the Chebar canal, in the fields of Tel Aviv, in the communities that had begun to take root in the Mesopotamian soil, a transformation was taking place. The exiled Jews were doing something that no other deported people in ancient history had ever managed to do. They were refusing to disappear. To understand what this means, you need to understand what normally happened to deported peoples in the ancient world. Deportation was not just a punishment, it was a technique of demographic engineering. The Assyrians had perfected the method over centuries. You plucked a people from their land, mix them with other populations, and in 2 or 3 generations, the original identity dissolved like salt in water. Language, religion, customs, memory, everything evaporated. It worked almost every time. It worked with the Arameans deported to Media. It worked with the Elamites redistributed through Assyria. It worked with the 10 northern tribes of Israel, deported by Sargon II in 722. They vanished so completely that 2,700 years of searching have failed to find them. Deportation was, in practice, a slow-motion genocide. No blood, no massacre, no drama. Just dilution, just forgetting, just time. But the Jews of Babylon did not dilute. And the question is, why? What did they have that was different? The short answer is that they had something no other deported people had. A book. Or rather, the fragments of what would become a book. When the Jews arrived in Babylon, they already carried with them scrolls of parchment and papyrus with sacred texts, primitive versions of what we now call the Torah, collections of psalms, prophetic oracles, genealogical lists, historical narratives, texts written over centuries by priests, scribes, and prophets in Jerusalem. These texts had a power that no wall, no temple, and no throne had. They were portable. You could lose the land. You could lose the temple. You could lose the king, the army, the political independence. But you could not lose the words. Not as long as someone knew how to read them, copy them, and teach them to their children. And that is exactly what the exiles did. The Babylonian exile is, for many scholars, the most important moment in the history of Judaism. More important than Moses at Sinai, more important than David in Jerusalem, more important than any event before or after. Because it was in the exile that Judaism stopped being the religion of a place and became the religion of a text. Before the deportation, the faith of the Israelites was anchored in concrete things. Solomon's temple, the altar of sacrifice, the Ark of the Covenant, the city of Jerusalem, the Promised Land. Without these things, the religion should have died. It should have become an archaeological curiosity, like the religion of the Moabites or the Ammonites, neighboring peoples of Judah who were also deported and also disappeared. But the Jews in Babylon did something no other ancient people did. They reinvented their religion to function without a temple, without an altar, without land, without a king. They transformed animal sacrifice into prayer. They transformed the pilgrimage to the temple into the study of Scripture. They transformed territorial identity into textual identity. You weren't Jewish because you lived in Judah. You were Jewish because you kept the Sabbath, circumcised your sons, and knew the stories of the patriarchs. And the prophets of the exile gave voice to this transformation with a literary power that the ancient world rarely equaled. Ezekiel. If you want to understand what the exile meant emotionally, not politically, not theologically, but at the visceral level, at the level of flesh and bone, read Ezekiel. Ezekiel was a priest from the Temple of Jerusalem, deported in the second wave in 597, along with King Jehoiachin. He was among the exiles settled in Tel Aviv, on the banks of the Chebar canal, probably an irrigation canal derived from the Euphrates in the region of Nippur. And there, sitting on the banks of that canal, on flat and foreign ground 1,500 kilometers from home, Ezekiel had visions. Visions that defy language. Visions that 2,500 years of interpretation have not been able to fully decipher. The first vision, the inaugural vision, the one that opens the book of Ezekiel, is one of the strangest passages in the entire Bible. A whirlwind coming from the north, a massive cloud, fire enfolding itself within the cloud. And inside the fire, 4 living creatures, each with 4 faces, of a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle, and 4 wings and feet like the sole of a calf's foot, sparkling like burnished brass. And with them, wheels within wheels, full of eyes, that moved in every direction without turning. And above the creatures, a sapphire throne, and on the throne a figure with the appearance of a man, glowing like glowing metal from the waist up and like fire from the waist down, surrounded by a rainbow. Ezekiel looked at that and fell on his face. And he heard a voice that said, "Son of man, I send thee to the children of Israel." Now scholars have debated the meaning of this vision for millennia. But one thing is clear in context. Ezekiel is saying that God did not stay in Jerusalem. God was not bound to the temple. God was not a local God, a mountain God, a God who only functioned within the borders of Judah. God was there in Babylon, on the banks of an irrigation canal in the middle of the Mesopotamian plain, and his glory was so overwhelming, so incomprehensible, so radically different from anything the Babylonian gods represented, that human language itself failed when trying to describe it. Wheels within wheels, eyes everywhere, multiple faces, fire that does not burn. Ezekiel's vision was a theological declaration disguised as a hallucination. The God of Israel was not defeated, he was not captured, he did not flee. He came along, he is here. And if he is here in the land of the enemies, in the capital of the empire that destroyed his temple, then he is greater than any empire, greater than any temple, greater than any god the Babylonians can put inside a statue. And then there is the vision of the valley of dry bones. Chapter 37 of Ezekiel. Perhaps the most powerful image in all prophetic literature. God takes Ezekiel in spirit to a valley covered with human bones, dry, old, bleached by the sun, scattered everywhere like the remains of an annihilated army. And God asks, "Son of man, can these bones live?" And Ezekiel gives the only honest answer possible. "O Lord God, thou knowest." And then God tells Ezekiel to prophesy over the bones. And as he speaks, the bones begin to come together, bone to bone, sinew over sinew, flesh over flesh, skin over skin. And the bodies stand up, but without breath, without life, like standing corpses. And God tells Ezekiel to prophesy to the wind. And the breath enters them, and they live, and they stand on their feet, an exceeding great army. And God explains, "These bones are the whole house of Israel. They say our bones are dried and our hope is lost. We are cut off for our parts. But I will open your graves and cause you to return to the land of Israel." Think of the impact of those words for an exile sitting on the banks of the Chebar. Everything he knew had been destroyed. His city was ash. His temple was rubble. His king was in prison. His neighbors, his friends, his relatives, dead, scattered, forgotten. He was a dry bone in the valley, and the prophet says, "You will live again. You will return." This is not over. The story has not ended. This promise, this absurd, irrational insistence against all visible evidence that the future still existed, is what kept Judaism alive during the exile. It wasn't stubbornness, it was faith, but not the comfortable faith of someone praying in a beautiful temple on a sunny day. Desperate faith of someone who looks at a field of bones and decides to believe in resurrection. And while Ezekiel prophesied in southern Mesopotamia, another Jew was living a completely different story, not on the banks of canals, but inside Nebuchadnezzar's palace. Daniel. The book of Daniel is one of the most controversial texts in the Bible. Disputed dating, debated literary genre, questioned historicity. Most critical scholars date the final composition of the book to the 2nd century BC, during the persecution of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, almost 400 years after Nebuchadnezzar. But that doesn't mean the book doesn't contain older traditions, real memories of the exile, echoes of experiences lived in the Babylonian court. And even as literature, even if you read Daniel as historical fiction, as a parable, as an allegory, what the text says about Nebuchadnezzar is extraordinary. Because the Nebuchadnezzar of the book of Daniel is not a villain. He is not a monster. He is not the bloodthirsty destroyer you would expect to find in a text written by descendants of the people he deported. The Nebuchadnezzar of Daniel is a complex man, powerful, arrogant, capable of cruelty and generosity, terrified by dreams he cannot understand, surrounded by advisors he cannot trust, and repeatedly confronted with a God who is greater than he is and greater than everything he built. The famous story of the fiery furnace, chapter 3, where Nebuchadnezzar orders a golden statue 27 meters high to be built and commands everyone to bow down before it, and 3 young Jews refuse and are thrown into a furnace heated 7 times hotter than normal, and survive. And Nebuchadnezzar sees a 4th figure walking with them in the fire. This story does not end with Nebuchadnezzar punished. It ends with Nebuchadnezzar marveling. It ends with him recognizing the power of the God of the Jews. It ends with him decreeing that no one in the empire can speak against this God. The text transforms the destroyer of the temple into an involuntary witness of the God of the temple. And then there is the dream, chapter 4 of Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar dreams of a gigantic tree, so high it touched the sky, so wide it covered all the earth, with fruit that fed everything that lived, and birds in the branches, and animals in the shade. And an angel descends from heaven and commands, cut down the tree, hew it down, break off its branches, scatter its fruit, but leave the stump with the roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and brass in the tender grass of the field. Let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let its portion be with the beasts for 7 times. Daniel interprets, the tree is you, Nebuchadnezzar. And what follows is the strangest scene in the entire book, perhaps the strangest scene in the entire Hebrew Bible. Nebuchadnezzar is driven from human society. He eats grass like oxen. His body is wet with dew. His hair grows like eagle's feathers. His nails grow like birds' claws. 7 times pass, 7 years, 7 seasons, 7 periods, until he lifts his eyes to heaven, his reason returns, and he blesses the Most High. What to make of this story? Historians and psychologists have tried everything. Some have suggested that Nebuchadnezzar suffered from clinical lycanthropy, a rare psychiatric condition in which the patient believes they have turned into an animal. Others have suggested porphyria, or a severe form of psychotic depression. Others point out that a fragmentary inscription known as the Prayer of Nabonidus, found at Qumran, describes a Babylonian king removed from power by illness, suggesting that some real tradition may be behind the account. But probably the most honest reading is the literary one. The author of Daniel is building a parable about power. The tree that touches the sky is the same arrogance as the Etemenanki. The king who thinks he is a god ends up eating grass. The builder who wrote his name on every brick of Babylon is reduced to an animal in the field. The message is not subtle. There is a limit to human ambition, and when you cross that limit, the fall is not political. It is ontological. You cease to be human. And this tension between the real greatness of Nebuchadnezzar and the theological reading the Jews made of that greatness is perhaps the most lasting legacy of the exile. Because the Jews did not deny Nebuchadnezzar's power. They didn't pretend Babylon was weak or ugly or insignificant. On the contrary, the biblical text recognizes the magnitude of what Nebuchadnezzar built. The golden statue, 27 meters high, the tree that covered the whole earth, the power that extended over all nations. The biblical authors looked at all this with eyes wide open and said, yes, it is immense, yes, it is impressive, and yes, it will fall. Because everything built by human hands falls. Everything that goes up comes down. Every tree that touches the sky will be cut down. And the stump that remains, the roots in the earth, bound with iron and brass, is all that remains of any empire. Nebuchadnezzar, of course, knew none of this. He didn't know that the exiles were writing. He didn't know that deported priests were sitting in mud houses on the banks of canals, editing and compiling texts that would survive everything. The Babylonian Empire, the Persian, the Greek, the Roman, the Middle Ages, the modern age, every civilization that has ever existed and that has ever disappeared. Nebuchadnezzar thought his immortality was in the bricks. It was in the walls. It was in the name stamped on baked clay. And for 2,600 years, those bricks turned to dust. Those walls collapsed. That name survives in museums, in fragments, in shards that fit in the palm of the hand. But the texts the exiles wrote by the rivers of Babylon, those are read every day, in every language on the planet, by billions of people who have never heard of Imgur Enlil or Nimiti Enlil, but who know Psalm 137 by heart. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept. The irony is almost unbearable. Nebuchadnezzar built the largest city in the world to be remembered forever, and he is remembered forever, but not for the bricks. He is remembered because the people he deported wrote about him. The destroyer of the temple was preserved by the people of the temple. The conqueror was immortalized by the conquered. He lives in human memory not because of what he built, but because of what he destroyed, and because of what the victims of that destruction created from the rubble. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because Nebuchadnezzar is still alive at this point in history, he is still the most powerful man in the world. And the final years of his reign hold mysteries that archaeology has not yet been able to fully solve. Nebuchadnezzar's final years are, for historians, a territory of shadows. Not because inscriptions are lacking. On the contrary, there are dozens of administrative texts dated from the end of the reign, records of rations, commercial contracts, legal documents stamped with dates from the 35th, 38th, 40th year of the reign. The bureaucratic machine of the empire continued to function with the precision of a clock. But what is missing are the great narratives. The royal inscriptions, those long, bombastic texts in which Nebuchadnezzar described his conquests, his constructions, his relationship with the gods, practically disappear after a certain point. The last great construction inscriptions date from the 30s of the reign. After that, silence. A silence that many scholars consider significant, but that no one can explain with certainty. What we do know is that Nebuchadnezzar reigned for 43 years. 43, think of that number. Alexander the Great reigned 13 years. Julius Caesar ruled Rome for 5. Napoleon had effective power for 15. 43 years on the throne of the greatest empire of the ancient world. This means that in 562 BC, the year Nebuchadnezzar died, there were whole adults in Babylon, 40-year-old men, who knew no other king. For an entire generation of Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar was not a ruler. He was a permanent condition of reality. The sun rose in the east, the Euphrates flowed south, and Nebuchadnezzar sat on the throne. It had always been that way. It always would be that way, except it wouldn't. Nebuchadnezzar died in the month of Ululu, approximately October of 562 BC. The circumstances of his death are unknown. No inscription describes the event. No text mentions illness, murder, or accident. What we know comes from the Babylonian Chronicle and later sources. He died, and his son Amel-Marduk ascended the throne. That's it. The man who built the largest city in the world, who destroyed Jerusalem, who deported entire nations, who stamped his name on millions of bricks. This man exits history with a bureaucratic note, a change of name in the records. Where before it was written year 43 of Nebuchadnezzar, now it is written accession year of Amel-Marduk. The machine continues, the name changes, the gear turns. But what happened after Nebuchadnezzar's death is as important as what happened during his life, because the empire he built, the most powerful in the world, protected by the largest walls ever raised, fed by the most fertile plain on the planet, administered by a bureaucracy that functioned with almost mechanical efficiency, this empire began to crumble almost immediately, not from the outside in, from the inside out. And the speed of the disintegration is, in itself, a judgment on the nature of Nebuchadnezzar's power. Because when an empire survives its founder, it means the institutions are strong. When an empire crumbles without its founder, it means the founder was the empire, that the whole thing depended on one man, that the walls, the temples, the gardens, the bureaucracy, all of it was scenery. What held the building up was an individual will. And when that will ceased to exist, the entire building began to crack. Amel-Marduk, Nebuchadnezzar's son, called Evil Merodach in the Bible, reigned for 2 years. 2. The book of 2 Kings mentions a detail about him. In the first year of his reign, he released Jehoiachin, the king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar had deported in 597 from prison, and gave him a place of honor at the Babylonian court, above the other captive kings. He gave him new clothes, and Jehoiachin ate at the king's table for the rest of his life. It is a small detail, almost insignificant in the context of world history, but for the Jewish exiles, this gesture meant everything. The king of the lineage of David was alive, he was free, he was being honored in the court of the conqueror. The lineage had not been extinguished, but Amel-Marduk did not last. In 560 BC, after only 2 years on the throne, he was murdered in a palace coup led by his own brother-in-law, Nebuchadnezzar, a general who had participated in the siege of Jerusalem 26 years earlier. Nebuchadnezzar reigned for 4 years. 4. He conducted a military campaign in Cilicia, in southern present-day Turkey, and died in 556, apparently of natural causes. His son, Nabopolassar, took the throne. Nabopolassar was a child, and children on the throne of the most powerful empire in the world do not last. He was murdered in a matter of months, some sources say weeks, by a group of conspirators led by a man named Nabonidus. Do the math. In 6 years, 3 kings, 2 murdered, 1 dead possibly of disease. Nebuchadnezzar's dynasty, the house of Nabopolassar, which had toppled Assyria and dominated the world, was exterminated in less time than it took Nebuchadnezzar to build the eastern wall of Babylon. And then came Nabonidus, and with Nabonidus, the history of Babylon enters its strangest chapter. Nabonidus was not of the royal family. He was not a general. He was not a priest of Marduk. His mother, Adagupi, was a priestess of the god Sin, the moon god, in the city of Haran in northern Mesopotamia. And Nabonidus brought this devotion to sin to the throne of Babylon with an intensity that shocked the capital's religious establishment. Imagine the scene. You are a priest of Marduk at the Esagila, the largest temple in the world. Your family has served Marduk for generations. Nebuchadnezzar spent fortunes renovating and beautifying your temple. Marduk is the god of Babylon. Marduk is the reason Babylon is the capital of the world. And suddenly, the new king begins to divert resources to the temples of sin. He begins to promote the moon god above Marduk. He begins to question the primacy of the god who sustains the entire Babylonian cosmic order. If this sounds like political madness, it's because it was. It was like a medieval pope arriving at the Vatican and announcing that Odin is actually the true god. But Nabonidus did something even more inexplicable. After a few years on the throne, he simply left. He left Babylon. He took an army, marched into the Arabian desert, conquered the oasis of Tamar, a commercial city in the northwest of the Arabian Peninsula, and stayed there for 10 years. 10 years. The king of Babylon abandoned his capital for an entire decade. He left his son Belshazzar as regent and vanished into the desert. No one knows exactly why. Theories range from religious conflict with the clergy of Marduk to strategic trade routes to mental instability. But the practical result was that for 10 years, the New Year's festival, the Akitu, the most important ceremony in the Babylonian calendar, where the king took the hand of the statue of Marduk to renew his divine mandate, was not celebrated. 10 years without Akitu. For the Babylonians, this was more than negligence. It was as if cosmic order was suspended, as if the contract between gods and men had expired, and no one had renewed it. And while Nabonidus stayed in the desert, and Belshazzar administered an increasingly discontented capital, a force was growing in the east that would make all this irrelevant. Cyrus. Cyrus, the second of Persia, whom history would know as Cyrus the Great. Cyrus was king of Anshan, a small kingdom in southwestern Iran, who in a few years had done something that seemed impossible. He had defeated the Medes, absorbed their empire, conquered Lydia in Western Asia Minor, and unified a stretch of territory that went from the Aegean to the Hindu Kush. And now, at the end of the 540s, Cyrus's eyes were turned toward Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar's city, the invincible walls, the last great prize. And here, history reaches one of those moments that seem too much like fiction to be real, but are. In October 539 BC, 23 years after Nebuchadnezzar's death, the Persian army arrived at the gates of Babylon, and the gates opened. No siege, no prolonged battle, none of the epic resistance that the thickest walls of the ancient world should have guaranteed. Sources differ on the details. The Nabonidus Chronicle says there was a battle at Opis on the Tigris River, where the Babylonian army was defeated, and that after that Chebar surrendered without a fight, and that Babylon was taken without a battle. The Cyrus cylinder, the famous clay inscription Cyrus ordered produced after the conquest, goes further. It says that Marduk, the god of Babylon himself, was furious with Nabonidus for his impiety and chose Cyrus as an instrument of divine justice. That Marduk scoured all the countries, seeking a righteous ruler, and found Cyrus, and called him to rule the world. That the Persian troops entered Babylon peacefully, and that the Babylonian people received Cyrus with joy. Propaganda? Without a doubt. The Cyrus cylinder is imperial propaganda, sophisticated, brilliant, but propaganda. Cyrus was doing exactly what every intelligent conqueror does, legitimizing his conquest in the religious language of the conquered. I didn't invade Babylon. Marduk invited me. But behind the propaganda, there is a historical fact that no narrative can hide. Nebuchadnezzar's walls did not work. The greatest fortifications of the ancient world, those double walls, triple walls, with a flooded moat, with towers every 20 meters, wide enough for 2 chariots to pass side by side, did not save Babylon, not because they were weak, because what was inside them had already rotted, a demoralized garrison, a clergy furious with their own king, a population that watched the New Year's festival be cancelled 10 times in a row, an absent king, a regent without real authority. Nebuchadnezzar's walls were perfect. The problem is that walls do not defend cities. People defend cities. And the people of Babylon, in October 539, had nothing left they wanted to defend. And what Cyrus did after entering Babylon directly interests our story, because Cyrus was a different kind of conqueror. Where the Assyrians deported and the Babylonians destroyed temples, Cyrus restored. The Cyrus cylinder announces the restoration of destroyed sanctuaries, the return of divine statues to their original temples, the repatriation of deported populations to their ancestral lands. And among these populations were the Jews. The book of Ezra records the decree, "Thus saith Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord God of heaven hath given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he hath charged me to build him an house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is there among you of all his people? His God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, and build the house of the Lord God of Israel." Ezekiel's dry bones in the valley were rising. In 538 BC, less than 50 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, the first groups of Jewish exiles began to return. Not everyone. Many stayed in Babylon. They had been born there, built lives there, had businesses, properties, families. The Jewish community of Mesopotamia would survive for another 2,500 years until the exodus of Iraqi Jews in 1950 and 1951. But those who returned carried with them something they didn't have when they left: the texts, the parchment scrolls that had been edited, compiled, expanded, and refined during the exile. The revised versions of the Torah, the prophetic collections, the Psalms, the Lamentations, a book that kept a people alive when everything said they should die. And they also carried an idea that did not exist before the exile, or that existed only as a vague intuition, and that the exile transformed into absolute conviction: monotheism. Not the practical monolatry of pre-exilic times. Our God is the main one, but the others exist. Real monotheism. There is only one God. He created everything. He rules everything. The gods of the nations are wood and stone, gold and silver, the work of human hands. They have eyes and see not. They have ears and hear not. They have mouths and speak not. There is only one, and this one does not live in a temple. He does not live in a city. He does not live in a country. He lives in the words. He lives in the text. He lives anywhere someone opens the book and reads. And here is where Nebuchadnezzar's story reveals its final irony, the deepest, most devastating irony, one that no Babylonian scribe could have foreseen and that perhaps no Jewish prophet fully understood. Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the Temple of Jerusalem to demonstrate that Marduk was superior to the God of Israel, to prove that the local god of an insignificant mountain on the periphery of the empire was no match for the Lord of the Assyria. And by destroying the temple, Nebuchadnezzar forced the Jews to do the only thing that could transform their tribal religion into a universal faith. He forced them to abandon the place and embrace the text. He forced them to discover that God did not need walls, that the divine presence could inhabit a community gathered around words, not around stones, that the sacred was portable, that faith could survive total destruction and come out stronger on the other side. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar, in trying to kill the God of Israel, made that God immortal. By destroying the small house in Jerusalem, he forced the Jews to build a house that fit the entire world. Nebuchadnezzar's most destructive action produced the most creative result in the religious history of humanity, and Marduk, the god in whose name all this was done, disappeared. When the Persians took Babylon, Marduk was still worshipped. When the Greeks arrived with Alexander in 331, the cult continued, but weakened. When the Parthians took control of Mesopotamia, Marduk was an echo. And at some point in the early centuries of the Christian era, the last priest of Marduk performed the last ritual in the Assyria, which by then was already a ruin. And the religion that had sustained Mesopotamian civilization for 3,000 years simply ceased to exist. No drama, no persecution, no decree, just silence. The temple that Nebuchadnezzar covered in gold and lapis lazuli became a mound of earth that local Bedouins called Babil. And the god who had no temple continued to be worshipped in Jerusalem, in Rome, in Alexandria, in Babylon, in every synagogue, in every church, in every mosque on the planet. But this is not just a story about gods. It is a story about what lasts, about what really survives when centuries pass over everything. Because if you could go back to Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, if you could walk down the processional way at the height of its glory, with the glazed lions shining on the walls and the smell of incense coming from the Assyria and the sound of hymns to Marduk echoing between the walls, if you could touch those bricks engraved with the king's name, feel the cuneiform wedges under your fingers, and someone told you that all of it was going to disappear, you would laugh. You would say it is impossible, that those walls will last forever, that that temple will be there when the sun goes out, that that empire is eternal, and you would be wrong, completely, absolutely, catastrophically wrong. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon disappeared. And it didn't disappear like Rome, which fell but left imposing ruins, triumphal arches, colosseums, aqueducts that remain standing 2,000 years later. Babylon disappeared for real, physically, literally, because Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon was made of mud bricks. Millions and millions of clay bricks baked in the sun or in kilns, stacked and cemented with bitumen. And mud bricks, no matter how much you bake them, no matter how much bitumen you use, no matter how thick the walls are, mud bricks melt. Rain dissolves them, wind erodes them, the sun cracks them, their own weight crushes them. In a matter of centuries, without constant maintenance, the largest brick structures in the world turn into mounds of earth. Tells, as archaeologists call them, artificial hills formed by layers and layers of dissolved civilization. If you fly over southern Iraq today, you will see dozens of them. Every gentle hill in the middle of the plain is a dead city. Every elevation on the flat horizon is the corpse of a place that once had walls and temples and markets and children playing in the streets. Babylon is one of those hills. When the German archaeologist Robert Koldewey arrived at the site of Babylon in 1899, what he found was exactly that: mounds of earth, shapeless hills sprouting from the Mesopotamian plain, about 90 kilometers south of Baghdad. The locals knew there was something there. Ancient bricks surfaced on the ground, and Bedouins and merchants had been looting the site for centuries, selling inscribed bricks to European collectors. But no one had excavated systematically. Koldewey stayed for 18 years, from 1899 to 1917, when World War I finally drove him out. He and his team unearthed the Ishtar Gate, the Processional Way, fragments of the walls, palace foundations. And what did they find on almost every brick they unearthed? The name: Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, son of Nabopolassar, king of Babylon, stamped into the clay millions of times, a man's obsession with his own immortality repeated to the point of absurdity. Here lies a reflection that might be uncomfortable. Nebuchadnezzar's bricks, those bricks he stamped with his name like a child writing their name on a school desk, those bricks are the reason we know so much about him. They are the reason we can reconstruct his walls on paper, estimate the dimensions of his palaces, map the layout of his streets. The king's vanity is, ironically, the king's gift to posterity. If Nebuchadnezzar hadn't had this compulsion to stamp his name on every available surface, we would know much less about Neo-Babylonian Babylon. Archaeologists found so many bricks inscribed with his name that museums all over the world are full of them. The British Museum has hundreds. The Pergamon in Berlin has the Ishtar Gate reconstructed with original bricks. Even smaller university museums have their specimens. Nebuchadnezzar wanted his name to last forever, and it did, but not in the way he imagined, not as a symbol of living power, but as an artifact, as a museum piece, as an archaeological curiosity displayed behind glass for tourists who pass by looking at their phones. And then came the others who tried to reclaim Babylon. Because the idea of Babylon, the most powerful city in the world, the center of civilization, the place where humanity dared to build a tower to the sky, this idea has a magnetic power over leaders who see themselves as heirs to something grand. Alexander the Great died in Babylon in 323 BC, and in his final months he planned to restore it as the capital of his world empire. If he hadn't died at 32, perhaps he would have succeeded, but he died. And Babylon continued to sink into the earth. Centuries passed, the sand covered everything. Nebuchadnezzar's walls melted in the reign of 2 millennia. The canals clogged. The plain that was the most fertile in the world became desert because no one maintained the irrigation system, and Babylon slept. Until in the 20th century, another man looked at those mounds of earth and saw something no one else saw. Saddam Hussein. The Iraqi dictator who ruled Iraq from 1979 to 2003 looked at the ruins of Babylon and saw himself as the new Nebuchadnezzar. And here, the story enters a cycle that would be comical if it weren't tragic. Saddam ordered parts of Babylon to be rebuilt, not restored, rebuilt. He raised new walls over the ancient foundations. He built a palace for himself on an artificial hill inside the archaeological site, from where he could look down and contemplate the ruins, like an owner contemplates his land. And on the new bricks, on the reconstruction bricks, he ordered an inscription to be stamped. Do you know what it said? In the reign of the victorious Saddam Hussein, President of the Republic, may God preserve him, guardian of great Babylon, who rebuilt it in the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, son of Nabopolassar. He placed himself beside Nebuchadnezzar, literally, on the same brick, with the same technique, with the same vanity. And Saddam Hussein's fate is so instructive it seems like a parable. The man who compared himself to Nebuchadnezzar, who ordered coins to be minted with the two profiles side by side, who commissioned documentaries about the shared glory between the ancient king and the modern president. This man was toppled by an invading army, plucked from a hole in the ground, tried by a court of his own countrymen, and executed on a December dawn. The palace he built over Babylon was occupied by American troops during the 2003 invasion. Foreign soldiers parked tanks among the ruins. They filled sandbags with earth that contained 3,000-year-old archaeological fragments. A military helipad was built next to the Temple of Nineveh, and UNESCO, horrified, tried to document the damage that military operations had caused to the site. Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem. 2,500 years later, the spiritual heirs of Jerusalem, the Christian West, the civilization born from that book the Jewish exiles wrote on the banks of the Euphrates, returned and stepped on Babylon with combat boots. If that isn't historical irony, nothing is. But Nebuchadnezzar's story teaches us something that goes beyond irony, something that is perhaps the most important lesson antiquity has to offer the modern world. And that lesson has to do with the difference between power and meaning. Nebuchadnezzar had power. He had the largest army in the world, the largest walls, the largest city, the largest temples, the greatest wealth. By the criterion of pure power, the capacity to impose one's will on other human beings, Nebuchadnezzar was one of the most successful men who ever lived. 43 years on the throne, no successful internal revolt, no decisive military defeat after Carchemish, an empire that functioned with impressive bureaucratic efficiency. By any metric of power, Nebuchadnezzar won. But Nebuchadnezzar's power did not survive Nebuchadnezzar. His son was murdered in 2 years. His empire fell in 23. His dynasty was exterminated. His religion disappeared. His city melted in the rain. His God became a footnote in ancient history books. And the people he tried to erase, that small, insignificant people, without an army, without walls, without wealth, without anything but a handful of scrolls and a stubbornness that defied all logic, that people still exists. They still read the same texts. They still weep before the same wall. They still celebrate the same festivals. They still tell the same stories. And not only did they survive, they gave the world the 2 largest religions in history, Christianity and Islam, both direct daughters of the theological revolution that the Babylonian exile provoked. And perhaps the question this story forces us to ask is not about Nebuchadnezzar. Perhaps the question is about us, about what we are building, about whether we are building walls or texts, whether we are piling up bricks with our name or writing words that will survive our death, because Nebuchadnezzar's bricks are in museums, and the words of the Jewish exiles are in 3 billion homes. Think about that. 3 billion people, Christians, Muslims, and Jews, live today under the direct influence of a book that was written, in large part, by stateless refugees sitting by a river in Mesopotamia, weeping with longing for a destroyed city. The psalms they composed are still sung. The prophecies they compiled are still read. The stories they told are still taught to children. The worldview they articulated, a single universal God who cares about justice, who hears the cry of the oppressed, who does not live in palaces, but in the hearts of those who seek him. This worldview shaped Western civilization, Islamic civilization, and by extension, the entire world. Nebuchadnezzar built gardens that defied gravity. But the exiles planted an idea that defied time. Nebuchadnezzar raised walls that no army could tear down, but the exiles wrote words that no empire could silence. Nebuchadnezzar stamped his name on millions of bricks, but the exiles put the name of God on every page of a book that became the most read, most translated, most influential in the history of humanity. And when we look back, when we look at this whole story, at those 70 years that shook the world, at this confrontation between the greatest empire on earth and the smallest people on earth, what we see is not the victory of the weak over the strong. It's not a fairy tale. It is something more disturbing and truer than that. What we see is that power without meaning dissolves, that empires built only on force disappear when the force ends, that bricks melt but words do not, that golden temples sink into the earth, but a true idea floats over the centuries as if it weighed nothing at all. And perhaps that is the true story of Nebuchadnezzar, not the story of a king who went mad and ate grass, although that story, biblical as it is, carries its own symbolic truth about the fragility of human power. Not the story of a genius builder who raised wonders, although he did exactly that. Not the story of a brutal conqueror who destroyed cities and deported nations, although that too is undeniably true. The true story of Nebuchadnezzar is the story of what happens when a man who has everything, all the power, all the wealth, all the glory, all the control, encounters something he cannot control, an idea, a faith, a sacred stubbornness that refuses to die no matter how many temples you burn, how many walls you tear down, how many people you drag in chains for 500 miles of desert. Nebuchadnezzar won every battle. He won every siege. He won against every enemy he could see and touch and imprison and kill. But he lost the only battle that mattered, the battle against an idea that was greater than he was, greater than his empire, greater than his God. And that is the lesson that echoes through 2,600 years of history and reaches us here, now, in this moment. Power builds impressive things, but only meaning builds eternal things. Nebuchadnezzar's bricks are in museums. The words of his captives are everywhere. And if anyone needed proof that the most powerful weapons in the world are not swords, nor armies, nor walls, they are stories, they are ideas, they are words written by people who had nothing else. The story of Nebuchadnezzar is that proof. If you've made it this far, click on the next video appearing on your screen. I've set it aside especially for those who watched this one until the end.